is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I'm Christiana Ellis,
And I am Mike Martine.
and this is a podcast that we do sometimes where we are watching through the American Film Institute's top 100 movies. And we have been doing this for a long time, and very slowly we have made our way through three-quarters of the movies. And we
Yeah.
are today going to talk about number 26 and 25, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and To Kill a Mockingbird. And, sometimes it's fun to talk about how different or how similar the two movies are in any given episode, but dang. Just in terms of, especially in today's political climate, both of these movies being kind of instrumental films that when you talk about a movie that looks at the darker side of some political issue but also comes out with what is attempting to be a very inspiring, more optimistic or idealistic message that fighting the good fight against the forces of evil sorts of thing. It's like when you have a hero character making the big impassioned speech, like you got that in both of these movies. So we are as we do. We start with one and then go to the other. But so the first one today was number 26. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and
Yep.
this was a movie that I had not seen prior to us doing this whole exercise. Now, I originally watched it for this podcast a while back, but we just didn't do an episode for a while. So I rewatched it just recently. So now I have seen it. But you had seen it. What were you what was your thoughts about it before rewatching it for this purpose?
Honestly, I watched it so long ago that I didn't remember all of what it was about. I remembered it was about, you know, my memory of it was basically, yeah, a naive guy goes into Washington, finds out there's a bunch of corruption, and stands up against it, and we all cheer. And throughout it, it gives us a exposition on how lawmaking works, kind
Mm-hmm.
of like the old musical, like How a Bill Becomes a Law. Like there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of, I remembered a lot of that in this movie, and so those things still happened. There was a naive guy who went in, saw a bunch of corruption, tons of exposition on how the government works,
Mm-hmm.
and gives an impassioned speech and wins at the end. Um, but I didn't remember any of the nuances to it, and particularly like Claude Rains' performance.
Mm-hmm.
That it's really good. As kind of goofy as the premise is, like it really delivers on that, and it makes a lot of sense. Like especially back in the 30s when this came out, as a good way to expose the greater country to how does politics supposed to work and how does it kind of
Mm-hmm.
really work, and where does this corruption come from and how does that get involved in it,
Mm-hmm.
and and this aspirational story of can we get beyond it, which of course obviously you know
Well,
we have not fully,
yeah.
but it's an interesting, just kind of essay. Almost, it's like an essay movie,
Mm-hmm. Well, it is interesting because we talked about this back when we did the other Capra movie on the list. Uh, I'm suddenly blanking on it. The freaking Christmas one. I cannot think of the title at the moment.
Oh, It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah. Oh my God. So I guess we haven't done that yet. Why did I think we had already? Maybe just because I rewatched that for some other reason recently. I can't remember why.
We have not done it.
I don't know. But in any event, I feel like a discussion that we have had is about how the cliche about what it means for a movie to be Capra-esque is interesting because usually what we mean when we would call a movie Capra-esque is that it is very schmaltzy and maybe kind of shallow, right? That's
Right.
usually what like people would mean. Um, but it's kind of his actual movies are really not so much like that. Like there's only the most superficial
Sorry,
reading of them.
it happened one night is a Capra movie as well.
Ah, okay. We must have talked about it at then.
Yeah, because we have done that one.
Yeah. So I, it's interesting how even though maybe it's just a reflection of the message that people are left with, that they kind of come away with at the end. You know, just like what you were saying in terms of what you vaguely remembered about the movie is this like this feeling of like the good guy fights the good fight and wins and hooray, isn't America great? That sort of feeling, right? But that's kind of not super what's in the movie. I mean, there's aspects of that, but it's I went through kind of a complicated series of emotions watching this movie for the first time. But let's briefly before we get into it, anyone who's not seen it at all and not familiar with it, you know, Mike gave a pretty high level, um, you know, sort of big hit, greatest hits summary. But the premise of the movie is that the senator of a state which is never named has just died, and the governor and the remaining senator and a number of other figures are frustrated. Not only has their sort of political ally just died, but it also seems like they're right in the middle of trying to push for a very important big appropriations bill. I think they called it something else, but I don't doesn't it's not really important. But they're in the middle of that push, and so now the law is that the governor has to appoint a new senator until an election can be had. And so they're trying to decide who they should pick. And what they eventually do is they pick Jefferson Smith, who is Jimmy Stewart's character, um, partly on the grounds that he's naive, doesn't really know anything about Washington, and therefore they expect him to be easy to control.
Right, because well, there's a little piece in there that kind of helps lay the groundwork for the corruption in that the governor is debating, you know, who he should nominate,
Mm-hmm.
and it comes down to two people. There's a committee of people, you know, a committee that he respects and answers to, who is demanding one person,
Yeah.
and then there is the influential financial people. You know, it never really says other than the guy owns like a bunch of newspapers, but it sounds like he also owns like other things. But
Yeah, he's like a business mogul of a.
yeah, he's sort of this business mogul guy, and he
Mm-hmm.
wants another person, and so he's kind of torn. The governor's torn between these two, and he gets this recommendation from his kids that he should
Yeah.
go with the guy who runs the Boy Rangers, which is like the Boy Scouts basically, and then
Yeah.
he flips a coin and it lands on its side next to the article on the paper that is
About
about
yeah,
yeah,
about him putting out a fire,
right
and
about him putting out a fire, right, and so he decides that that sign, yes, but also to your point, well, this is easier because I can appease both sides because I can put somebody in there who has no agenda, and
mm-hmm.
then we can craft the agenda on him. And
Right.
so while it has kind of a silly way of how he gets there, like you're right, there is this sort of nefarious, like we're going to
Yeah.
control him. Yeah.
I will say that like at this part of the movie, watching it for the first time, I was a little bit afraid of the schmaltz factor. Part of that is because the like the kids, the governor's kids, is apparently there was this group of kids that did like a brothers act, where it was just all of these brothers who just like did this rapid fire patter bouncing lines off of each other, and it was like a whole shtick, right? Well, so they basically just transplanted that whole act and put those kids in this movie. So both this dinner scene and the scene later where like they're giving him the briefcase and that sort of thing is like apparently that's all like their gimmick is they do that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so, but like I kind of like the kids more now that I know that. But like in this early scene, I was just really feeling like kids don't talk like this. This isn't this. I don't buy this at all.
Right.
And then the
It's
coin,
convincing the governor. Yeah.
and then the coin flip landing on its side just felt a little bit too like, ooh, fate, waving its little glitter sprinkle dust all over the place. It's like it at that point I was feeling a little bit frustrated with it and not necessarily on board. But
Well, I think the reason part of what I brought that up is to your
mhm,
point about like the Capra-esque part and what you're left with is that is very Capra, and that there are those types of things in there, and there are
mhm,
definitely those things in It's a Wonderful Life, like with the bell ringing, the angel gets its wings, like that's just as
mhm,
goofy,
yeah,
but the overall package of the movie is much more nuanced,
yeah,
and yes, that was the goofy way they decided to use the
mhm,
shtick and then use the coin flip to be what like kind of leads him to that decision. But there is still the nefarious part of like, well, and it also makes sense for us because we can control him because he is naive and he respects the other senator who can tell him what to do.
mhm,
You
mhm.
know?
Yeah, because part of the whole backstory with the other senator and this business mogul, Taylor, is that they've apparently managed to get built into this big appropriations bill a dam being built in a certain specific place that is it's never explained exactly how it would work. They just use the word graft like that explains everything. But essentially, what it was going to be is a big financial windfall for the Taylor guy and his companies, and so he's essentially helping out the politicians who are going to get him this big windfall.
Yes, it's a very very classic case of a MacGuffin.
Yeah.
Where it exists. We all agree to the principle
Hmm.
that this dam makes him money, but without actually
Well, and
being
especially when
important.
parts of it don't really make sense, like when they try to frame Jefferson Smith later, it feels like, well, don't the things that you're trying to use to frame him defeat the whole purpose of what you guys were trying to do?
Yeah,
But in any way, so the point is, I think we're not meant to like. You're not supposed to worry about that. Just like
right.
that's not important. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Um, but the point is that there is sort of this corruption happening, and they're hoping to basically just use Jefferson Smith, Jimmy Stewart's character, as not as a patsy at this point, but really just a vote, someone who will vote the way we tell him to. And so they bring him in. His very first day in Washington, D.C. Goes a bit awry because he has literally got stars in his eyes about being in Washington, D.C. and the Capitol Dome. And this was another thing where I was still feeling like I was getting a little irritated with the schmaltz of like, he is so captivated by the purity of his love for his country that he literally just walks away from the train station without his bag and gets on a bus, leaving behind all of the people who've been bringing him to the Capitol, and he just goes sightseeing all by himself all day without his luggage, as though that's an ordinary thing that someone might do.
Well, but there's even a subtle joke about how absurd that is, though.
Yeah,
Like I know it's schmaltzy, but like later when he shows up, they're like, "Oh, he made it here. He's on his own and he's sober." Like
yeah.
basically, like only you like. Why the hell did he just disappear? Like, is
Yeah,
he?
well, essentially, yeah, they're all like, and there's some funny stuff about it, like the fact that he brought all of these pigeons and then all of these other bags, and so you've got the porters carrying all that stuff at the train station, but then like when they're just waiting around because they can't find him, there's a funny bit where I don't know who this other guy's supposed to be. He's one of the guys that works for the senator, I think. But essentially, one of the porters just says, "Sir, could you hold this for a minute?" and hands it to him, and then just leaves because they're basically saying, "We're not going to stand here holding the bags when the guy's not even here." So they just dump all the bags from and leave and so. But yeah, it's this whole thing of like, it's played kind of funny, but it just feels again like, what is this character? Like, is he supposed to be 6 years old? What, like, this is not the way a responsible adult works. He's supposed, like, even though he's supposed to be this naive idealist, he's still someone who, like, plans camping trips and stuff like that. You don't just walk away from the people that you're traveling. Anyway, I was feeling frustrated with that too. But all
See
of
that?
that leads into the introduction of the Jean Arthur character, Clarissa Saunders, who is amazing. I love her so much, and immediately it was her and her journalist buddy Diz that won me back over onto this movie's side
Yeah,
because
they're both great.
yeah, so she is like the receptionist slash office manager for the senator, but also does a lot more than that because she's very savvy politically. And then Diz is like her pet journalist, which like they're clearly old friends and they really like each other and they've got kind of a really cool like relationship where they joke about getting married, but it's
Yeah,
like
there's that funny part where they like get drunk at dinner and are like just like,
yeah,
but she's, you know, she, and again, there's like this subtle, well, to your point about the schmaltzy part and like, but
mm-hmm,
how it's always more nuanced. Like without the nuance, that's a goofy scene. Like
yeah,
them getting drunk at dinner and like
mm-hmm,
them agreeing to get married. But the subtext to that is that she is so fed up with watching what's happening to Smith
mm-hmm,
that she wants to leave Washington, and this is sort of her way of expressing it.
yeah, yeah,
Like I'm kind of done with this life,
mm-hmm,
and her joke to her buddy is like, "Well, let's just get married and like go somewhere." And of course, he has an affection for her, and so he's like, "Well, yeah, that sounds good." Like, and so he keeps reminding her as she kind of like moves away
yeah,
from the whole like we're getting married tonight. He's like, "Oh no, but wait, we're supposed to get married tonight," and she's like, "Oh yeah, that's right." And then she starts talking about Smith again and talking about the thing,
mm-hmm,
and then he starts to leave. He's like, "Oh, but we're supposed to get married." Oh yeah, that's right. And I mean,
yeah.
so the
But it's always
there's a
it's never
subtleness to her personality
yeah.
that's funny in what is sort of a goofy scene.
Right,
You know,
and it's not played like she's breaking his heart by leading him on. It's always played as you feel like this is like a drinking game that they've played over and over.
right? Yeah, there's this whole joke to it, and
Yeah,
that you know,
um, but yeah, but so the introduction with her is that she is the cynic. She's the one who's seen it all. She knows how the sausage is made, and she's over it. And and when she meets Jefferson Smith, her initial impression is like, what a dope this guy is. Can you believe what an idiot? Like the way he just walked away, he has no idea what's going on. They're going to eat him alive. And is frankly like, not my problem until they start making it her problem by
right?
having
People
her
start trying
babysit
to
him.
use her to eat him alive, quote
Yeah,
unquote,
right,
and she starts to feel like she doesn't want him to be eaten alive, and
right.
definitely doesn't want party to it. Yeah,
Yeah, so we get some stuff early on where like her initial reaction with him is she is just so frustrated at being like left to babysit him that she essentially drops him into the journalist pile, the pack of wolves, and like, yeah, sure, this guy is totally unprepared for life in Washington at all. Sure, let's just lead him into the press room, and have them have at him. And they do, the muckraker journalist thing of just like let's take advantage of this guy who doesn't realize that we're going to twist everything he says in the worst possible way, and use photos that make him look bad, and all of that sort of thing.
yeah. Like they find out he knows sign language, and so they ask him to start signing, but then find a picture that makes him look like he's making fun of like Indians
Mm-hmm.
or Native Americans.
Yeah. They have him do a
And
bird call that has him like this, and then they make it sound like he's saying, "Oh, Washington stinks."
yeah,
Yeah. And so they basically take advantage of him, and it gets him off to a bad start in his first day at in the Senate.
and
But
he's maybe the weirdest scene in the movie, I think. By the way,
which
where the weirdest scene in the movie to me is after that happens,
mm-hmm.
and he starts walking through Washington, punching everyone
Yeah.
who is reading the paper, and you expect it to be like exposed as like this like fever dream or like anger thing,
No.
but there's like it like supposedly like actually happened in the movie, and
Well, right, and like
there's
some of these people are
senator walking around punching everyone.
yeah.
You know what?
Like, and he's like a healthy, fit
Weird.
young man, and like some of the people he's punching look like they're 65.
Yes, he's like punching old people. Like it's
Yeah,
really
and
weird.
so, but it's played as a this guy What a rascal. Like, the movie plays it like that. Like, that's how we're supposed to feel. But I agree. I think that does, like, I sort of feel like, no, that's not okay.
I
But,
feel like even in 1939, if a senator just started walking through Washington punching old people, like
yeah. Well,
it would
it's,
be.
yeah, it's a Hollywood thing,
I
I
get
think.
it. It
Yeah.
was just, it's of all the scenes, that was the one that struck me as the
Yeah,
most.
no, I agree. It stands out as a like this feels well anyway. So in any event, so now he's in bad with the press, and he's in bad with Senate, and it's just not going well at all, and he's feeling kind of discouraged, and so his this other senator who he really respects and admires, and they literally bonded like, the senator knew Jefferson Smith's father, and there's like a pre-existing relationship and a lot of admiration there, and they've bonded. And so, even though this other senator knows, oh, we're basically bringing him into this political machine to just be another vote for us, and we're going to take advantage of him, but I do kind of actually like him. So here, he's feeling discouraged. So let's maybe have him write a bill. Sure, why
Right.
not?
And to bring that, the other senator is Claude Rains' character that I
Mm.
mentioned earlier. Um,
Who I
who,
still mostly think of as his role in Casablanca.
yeah,
That
but he,
that Notorious.
yes, but he is also very good outside of those roles.
Oh yes, I just like I don't know. Every time I think Claude Rains, it's like, oh yeah, he's that guy that I like in those movies. Anyway, but yeah, so he decides to write a bill, and this is the scene where, on the one hand, there is certainly a real presumptuousness about the way he essentially just hijacks Saunders' evening to say, oh no, you and me are going to stay here all night tonight while you teach me how to write a bill, without really any consideration whatsoever of, like, oh, you weren't doing anything, were you? You didn't have plans, did you? Because now you're staying here all night with me. That there was a little bit of a, like, wait a minute.
Well, yeah, I mean, and again, it played kind of funny because she's like, oh, you want to get it done fast? So like over the next 3 or 4 days? He's like, no, like
Like,
tonight.
yeah.
But so what I thought was funny, I thought it was less of the presumptuousness of her not having plans and more of like I saw it more of like trying to show his naivety of
Well,
like that you could just do that. Like that's how easy if you're just motivated,
right.
you just write a bill overnight.
Well,
You know.
but it is both of those things, because the
Well,
other
you're,
the other
you're right.
aspect is,
Yeah.
it's one thing for him to say, I'm going to stay here all night and write a bill, but the other piece of it is, I don't know how to write a bill, so
So
you have
you
to show me, and we're going to
right.
do it tonight. No matter, and there's no, he doesn't ask her if she's okay with staying. He just expects it. And that rubs me the wrong way a little bit. But the scene,
Fair. Yeah.
as the scene develops, though, I think it's interesting, because this is where we see her start to change in her feelings for him, because she's first, he's just such a dope. He's sappy. He can't get over, like, he can't hold a conversation if the Capitol dome is visible, because he'll just stare at that, and it's like, what an idiot this guy is. And now he's doing this. Oh, well, I'll just explain to him in the most cynical possible terms. Here's why it takes forever to get anything friggin' done. You're going to write a bill. It's going to take forever. It's going to get changed up. It's going to get marked and changed, and no one will agree. And then finally on the big day, they'll vote for it and it won't pass. And then you've wasted all your time. And he's like,
So
okay, so we'll get started right away then, huh?
so I did love that scene though because like I think in the high level summary I gave earlier, like it was a really good exposition into like how bills actually work
Mm-hmm.
because they talked about like, well, you'll propose the bill, it'll go to it'll go to the House will either vote on it or or make changes. If they send it back with changes, then the Senate either has to agree to those changes or make other changes. If they make other changes, then it goes to a committee, and the committee all argues about what should be in the bill, and then everybody has to agree. And then the big day comes. Like, but the whole it felt not exposition because of how, like your point, she's using it in the movie to explain to him why we shouldn't be doing this because it's
Mm-hmm.
just a waste of time and trying to dampen his enthusiasm. but it also plays as a good summary reminder of how bills work,
Mm-hmm.
which I thought was kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though it doesn't really come up in the rest of the movie because
It
that,
does, but
yeah,
that's why
but
I
yeah.
think that's why I thought it worked so perfectly because
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't about it coming up in the rest of the movie. It was about it was about trying to find a mechanism to explain how bills work to the American public through a movie with it feeling natural. And then
Mm-hmm.
yes, you throw it away. Like so I thought of it as truly government exposition that Capper was using.
Yeah.
And that's why I compared it to those old like videos that we had in the 80s and 90s where like the bill is singing and talks about how he becomes a law. Like it felt very much like that to me. And it had a dual purpose because it actually worked in the movie of her like trying to convince him not to be so enthusiastic, but yet also educating us all as to what it was with again. So it didn't matter that it doesn't come up later in the movie
Mm-hmm.
because it's not about that. You know, that's how I saw it, and I
Yeah.
liked it a lot because of that.
Yeah. Well, so in any event, so she is surprised because she's trying to discourage him and finds him undiscourageable. And so they're trying to, right? And so he's doing lots of things that she sort of is initially irritated by, but kind of gradually become sort of endearing, where she is just starting to realize that all of this passion and idealism he has are coming from like a sincere, genuine place. And yes, he may be naive, but he's not dumb. He is passionate. So there's lots of things that he doesn't understand about how the way this works, but he can see a beauty in the world that she had kind of forgotten about. And he describes it as like when you've been in a long tunnel and then you come out of the tunnel and everything is just all the more bright and colorful. And you should try to look at the world all the time like you've just come out of a tunnel. And she's sort of feel like I've always lived in the tunnel. I've never been out of the tunnel. And this is where she starting to admire his passion and his ideals, even as she realizes that's not going to be enough. He's still going to get trampled. And then there's this whole bit where she realizes at this point, oh, that place you randomly decided to put your boys' camp, which incidentally, we can maybe take a brief tangent to say building a specific boys' camp in one particular location is probably not the sort of bill that a federal senator should be doing.
Have
But
a national camp. Yeah, I mean
yeah, but whatever, it's fine. It's again, it's not that important. It's kind of moot ultimately anyway. But
right.
she hears him say where he intends to do it, and she's like, "Oh, I happen to know that's where they're planning to put that dam in that other bill." Oh, and he's like, "What? Is there some problem?" He's like, "No, no, never mind." But she knows that it's like, oh, that's probably going to cause fireworks, but does not tell him because, like what's she going to say, right? Like what possible reason could she give for why he should maybe not do that particular site,
Right.
you know? But in any event, she decides to actually she's not fully like in love with him or on board with him yet because mostly she sees this as like he's kind of a funny one, isn't he? Huh. Well, this is going to be interesting when he tries to propose this bill, and so we actually see her describing it in the next day, like when he's about to propose his bill. She's up there with Diz up in the gallery above, and kind of says, "Observe all of the players." So you watch the other senator here, and then this guy over here, and watch what happens, what they do when he mentions the words Willet Creek. And sure enough, they both go, "Huh? What? Uh-oh. No, 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 no." And they start, and so it becomes a whole thing where uh, they can't let him move forward with that bill because it'll just expose the problems with the shady nature of what they've done in their other piece. And so they kind of bring him in on board to this idea of like, okay, man, you're going to change yours and you're not going to ask questions why, because this is how things work. And his reaction is like, well, that sounds bad. I can't believe that that's true. And in particular, he is hurt and offended at the thought that this other senator that he so admired, Senator Payne, is like, what? You're just letting this business guy just tell you what to do? And it's interesting that we do actually get a moment of this other senator saying, due to the realities of how politics work, I had to compromise because compromising on this allows me to do so many other good things that I would not be able to do if I didn't compromise in this one.
Yep. And he even says, like, would you not agree that I've been a good representative for our state? Like, we have low unemployment, like this. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they're obviously they're kind of like buzzwords, but
Yeah.
the concept is still good. And this is, and it's why I kept like mentioning earlier on, like, Claude Rains' character and talking about Claude Rains playing this guy, because this is, he has a very complicated arc in this
Mm-hmm.
movie. And with any lesser of an actor, it is totally unbelievable
Yeah.
how he sort of operates. To go from the sort of nuanced, like, I'm going to tell this guy what to do, but I got a little affection for him because I knew his dad, and I got a little bit of my heart for him,
Mm-hmm.
to going through that complicated like argument with Taylor, the business mogul, about, well, I don't want to hurt him. I don't want him to like lose his like enthusiasm, and I don't want you to like hurt him as a person. And so I'm kind of like
Mm-hmm.
worried about that. And then, Taylor puts the pressure, the thumb on the scale,
Yeah.
and he kind of caves. And then he goes and explains what the part you just said, where you like, it's a believable thing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I made this compromise because I'm not, it's not because I'm a bad person. I made the compromise so that I could do good. And this is
Right.
how it had to work. And this is why you shouldn't be here,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't want to make that compromise. And that's what has to happen.
Yeah.
And then, like, obviously we'll get into more of what he does later, but it's all believable, like, through the whole arc.
Yeah. Where meanwhile, Taylor himself not nuanced at all, total straight
Nope.
up villain, mustache twirling might as well be. Which actually, in a fun way, though. I mean, the actor playing him is charismatic in that role, because there's that moment, like you said, where Senator Payne, this older senator, is kind of saying, "Well, I understand what we kind of have to do here, but I kind of like this kid. I don't want to destroy him." And the other guy's just like,
You might as well just shoot yourself.
yeah, yeah. Just it's like, hey, if you're not on board, you might as well just blow your brains out because I'm going to do whatever it takes to get this kid out of my way. And if that means breaking him in two, then we'll do that. Otherwise, hey, if you can get him out of my way, that's fine with me. But I'm certainly not going to stop doing what I need to do. And it's just this very sort of matter of fact, even jovial account of like, haha, your moral concerns are not something I'm worried about. That sounds like a you problem.
Yes. I mean, it's an amazing thing. He just straight up says, like, well, all right, I mean, if you're going to be like that, you might as well just go blow your brains. Like, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
Like, but he's so enthusiastic about it. You're like,
Mm-hmm.
that's weird.
Yeah.
And then throughout his whole role of like trying to take him down, like he like you said, he's very charismatic, but again, there's this enthusiasm around like
Mm-hmm.
motivating all the
Well,
papers to discredit him later.
yeah,
Like,
he's the big shot of
yeah,
like this is what he does. The Taylor machine. He's the he runs the machine. He can do whatever he wants, and he
right. So yeah,
relishes that.
when Smith disagrees with them and is going to go out and do whatever he's going to do, and Payne kind of feels like, oh well, if he's successful, it's going to be so bad for us. And Taylor's like, well, he's not going to be successful.
No,
Like,
like
I almost relish the fact that he's trying.
and yeah, and so sure enough, immediately as soon as Jimmy Stewart's character Jefferson Smith tries to expose this graft that he's learned about and explain what was going on, it all immediately turns. Senator Payne immediately turns on him. It turns out that the Taylor machine has fabricated and falsified all sorts of evidence that makes it look like it was actually Jefferson Smith who was doing the corrupt things by trying to have this camp be built on land that he was going to arrange to buy and all of that sort of thing. And they arrange for people to testify against him. They falsify documents. They forge his signature. And they pay a bunch of experts to come in and say, yep, we're sure it's his signature. Not forged at all. And it's interesting. There's a sequence where we see like 5 different handwriting experts disagree. But
Yeah, that was kind of, I didn't get that other than to like show the point that like it wasn't like so obvious, but it was an odd like.
well, I thought that it was kind of a combination of it makes sense that there would be multiple people brought in, and it kind of comes down to the fact that they've got a piece of paper, they say his name's on it. He says he didn't do it. So how do you know if it's his or not? And so, like, so the idea of handwriting experts is literally their only evidence. Except they also have the one witness who's essentially lying on, saying, yeah, I was there. We had this whole plan. We decided it, and here he is. Here's the signature. And so Jimmy Stewart is essentially, he is completely outplayed here. The Taylor machine is way too powerful for him. He doesn't have a chance. They convict him in committee, and the plan is that he's going to be expelled from Congress in disgrace. But through all of this, Saunders has been kind of heartbroken watching all of this play out because she had come to admire his idealism, and seeing him get destroyed this way. At first, she was planning to just run away, and that's this whole bit where she gets drunk and she's gonna, talking about getting married with Diz, and she's just gonna say, I can't bear to stay in a city where this happens to people. But eventually, she comes around to having a new plan where she's gonna try to see if she can help him save himself, essentially. And so she basically explains how, using this specific type of procedure, he can lead his way into a filibuster where, unless they want to violate their rules, the rules of the Senate, he can just keep talking and talking and talking as long as he wants, with the hope being that if he can at least get his side of the story out, maybe people back in their home state will take his side, and it'll start, there's time at least for him to try to defend his position instead of this existing problem. But the difficulty is that the Taylor machine also owns all the newspapers out there. So most people are still only hearing that side of the story. And then there's a whole bit where the timeline is very loose because we're told how many hours he's in there talking in the filibuster, and yet the stuff that's happening outside seems like it must take weeks, but whatever.
Right, like billboards going up and protests being like marches.
Yeah, marches and like hundreds and hundreds of letters.
Telegrams.
Telegrams, sure, okay. Yeah, and I suppose they do say wire the Senate, so I guess they're telegrams, but still, just the amount of stuff that happens because they recruit the Boy Ranger newsletter to try to get the word out, and it's like being distributed by kids, and then the Taylor machine literally hires big like union breakers to
go beat up the kids.
Yeah, beat up the kids and run them off the road and stuff like that. And in fact, actually, that's the point where it's kind of all coming to a breaking point where Jefferson Smith's mom calls Saunders and says, "Tell him to stop because kids are being hurt. It's not worth it." And so this is like this darkest moment when it seems like there's nothing to be done. And in the meantime, during this long filibuster, although most of the senators are kind of like, they're sort of trapped, but they know they can't talk forever. So they just have to ride it out. And most of the senators, there's a couple of them that have started to hear what he's saying and start feeling like if he would he do this if he was guilty? And actually, that started to bother me a little bit just because I think we have definitely seen that people who are guilty are frequently capable of extreme measures to protest their innocence. And it doesn't have anything to do with this. It's like either I'm right or I'm crazy. And it's like, well, no, not really. Because the people do illegal things and then protest their innocence to extreme measures a lot. That's like a thing. Anyway.
Yeah, it did.
But people could certainly find him sincere, right?
Yeah. What I also like, and again, going back to like the earlier part about like her description of how bills work,
Mm-hmm.
I thought that the filibuster was also done kind of like that,
Mm-hmm.
in that had a dual purpose. Like, yes, it was important for the movie that he does this filibuster, but they do a very, very careful exposition of like how a filibuster works and like why you do it and what are the rules behind it and like all
Mm-hmm.
of this stuff, which like it's told in the sense of like, oh, he's naive in the Senate, so he has to learn the rules. But I felt like it's talking to us and like reminding us, like, here's how filibusters work. Here's why this is a thing.
Yeah.
And here's how it works, and here are the mechanisms behind it. Not just to help us understand the movie, but to help us understand that part of the government. And I thought that was really cool. Like, I liked that it kind of like separated that part without truly separating it. Without, it's not like they broke the third wall and they came and they walked and talked to us and said, "Hello, audience. Here's how a filibuster works."
Yeah.
And I thought that was very clever. Like all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and you're right to the point of like all the things mixing. Like, yes, that would have taken way longer for them to do all of those reporting and the riots and all that stuff.
Yeah, it just seems really unlikely that would have all happened.
Like, yeah,
Yeah,
but it doesn't matter ultimately because
no,
that's the point. Yeah.
So, but in any event, he's up there and he's literally talking until he just absolutely can't anymore, and he passes out. And that's kind of the breaking point for Senator Payne too, where he has been struggling, knowing that he's now in a position of having to assist with the destruction of this man he cares about, and knowing that like I'm the one that has the power to make this stop, and I'm only not doing that because I'm trying to protect my own reputation as someone who doesn't do the sorts of things that I know that I am actually doing. Yeah. I'm having to be out there and saying he deserves to be expelled from the Senate for doing the things that I know I am actually doing. So I'm accusing an innocent man of the crime that I am guilty of, and it's destroying the idealism and purity of this man that I admired for those very qualities. And so there's a moment where we don't specifically see it, but it's implied that he does try to kill himself, and the gun is wrestled away from him. Uh-oh, my Hangout has crashed, so I might have to just see if I can get that back going. All right. All right, I am back. The Hangout crashed.
Oh, I was gonna say, like it's gone dark here.
Yeah, so I will have that this all back in just a moment. There we go, all set. So I don't know why that happened.
I don't see it though.
You don't see what?
The Hangout, like it's still just a black screen for me with.
Okay. I mean, you don't see me? You hear me but don't see me?
I hear you, but my screen is literally just a black box with me in the bottom right corner, like where my like live feed is, but the two Hangout pieces are black.
Well, hopefully that will resolve itself shortly because they're like it's running. I have the stream going, showing what it ought to look like with both of us on it. So.
All right. Well, I'll trust you.
Yeah. Hopefully it'll
pop you in the dark.
Yeah. So yeah, if it doesn't fix itself in a few minutes, we'll see what we can do. But I hopefully it'll just resolve itself.
Okay.
So in the meantime, the where were we? So Senator Payne apparently tries to kill himself, which frankly um, is a little bit frustrating, just because we imagine that if he was successful there, like, would anyone have ever found out? Because the only reason we get a happy ending in this at all is because Senator Payne basically fesses up in front of everybody. Comes
Yeah.
out and yells and says, "No, no, he's actually not guilty. It was a total false accusation that I made up because everything he was saying was true." And so, I, and so that leads to, Jefferson Smith vindicated, happy ending after all. And so I think in some ways, we do get the happy ending, and I was moved in the moment, but certainly thinking back on it, I have to say that just from a perspective of whether this movie leaves me feeling optimistic or not, it's like the only reason we got a happy ending is because one of the bad actors got, and I don't mean like bad acting, I mean like person doing a bad thing. One of the criminals involved had a crisis of conscience and decided to just spill. It's like, how often does that happen in real life?
Well, I feel like that's kind of supposed to be part of it. Again, there's this nuanced thing of like, that's how complicated corruption is in Washington. Is that unless somebody just feels guilty enough to like tell you about it,
Mm-hmm.
you can't find it. You know, and I mean, I had seen it before, so I had remembered like just subconsciously that there was a happy ending.
Mm-hmm.
But watching it again, especially knowing that like it's in the same one as To Kill a Mockingbird, which doesn't exactly have a happy ending.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I it's not as negative as this could have been.
The courthouse part certainly doesn't.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, yeah, there's definitely some pieces there. But so I was watching, I was like, wait a minute, does he just give up? Like, because
Mm-hmm.
you can see it leading to that. You know, you've got the kids are getting hurt, and she's trying to convince him to stop, and then the other senator brings in all the telegrams that all say, we're all from people from his state that say, stop, 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 stop.
Mm-hmm.
And reading through them, he's understanding, and that I feel like that's one of the greatest moments of the movie is when he's there and he's just like, I, do I quit? Do I just say you
Mm-hmm.
won? And you're waiting for him to be like, look at him and say you won. And instead he walks over there and says, so this is a lost cause.
Mm-hmm.
And you remember that you and I both know somebody who fought hard for lost causes.
Yeah.
And so those are the ones most worth fighting for. And then that's when he walks over and passes out. So it's like his evoking the memory of his dad to the senator and
Mm-hmm.
his own personality, and then him like actually being hurt,
Right.
like passing out, that just like sets him off.
Mm-hmm.
But I back to the summary of this, like to your point, like I think that was part of the point of the movie is that yes, had he just gone off and killed himself, or had he never fessed up, like this never would have come out. Like this, that's how deep this corruption runs. Is that without him actually having all of these things work in his favor, that's the only way that it could get exposed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's both happy in the movie and also somewhat depressing in reality, that's
Mm-hmm.
true.
Right.
That
Yeah.
as long as in certain cases, as long as in corruption, as long as nobody speaks up, they just go on,
Yeah. Well, and so like the complicated feelings that I had, that I described watching this movie for the first time was, there was initially the schmaltier bits at the beginning, and just feeling like it's one thing to say this character is kind of a naive person, but they show him just doing stuff that doesn't read as naive so much as just dumb, and
Sure.
I didn't especially find that very compelling. But then, Saunders and Diz show up, and they're great, and I feel like I would watch a whole series of movies just about those two. Um, and they're kind of redeeming of like they're, and I think it's supposed to be this way, right? Like they're the audience surrogate, where
Hmm.
we're supposed to feel that he's dumb, and then he wins us over with the purity of his sincere, passionate ideals, right? Just like he kind of wins over Saunders, and that's supposed to kind of be, where we're the, Saunders is in some ways more the protagonist than Jefferson Smith is in some ways.
Yep. Well, I
Uh,
love, and I think there's some great nuanced things to her as well, like the
mhm,
fact that she, we get this sort of exposition that, well, she's fine with everyone calling her Saunders. Like she does have a first name,
mhm,
and is looking for someone to like call her by that, like as like a term of endearment, and so she almost tries to force Diz to do it when they're going to get married.
mhm.
And that awkward, like there's that like awkward, like, well, call me, I think it's Clarissa or whatever, and then the first person that calls her Clarissa is actually Smith's mom,
Yeah.
from the thing, and she just lights
Well,
up.
because she knows it's like not only was he telling the truth when he said he was going to tell his mom all about her, but when he did, he must have called her Clarissa because that's yeah,
Right. So
yeah,
he is by proxy realizing that he refers to her as Clarissa when discussing her, even though
yeah.
he calls her Saunders in the case, and when he needs to, because he's doing what he's supposed to do
Hmm.
in the business context. And it's just, I mean, it was such a small thing, but it was
Yeah.
like those kind of nuanced things are what make these movies really good. Is when they
Hmm.
have the
You kind of
text
broke up on
that's
me on
kind
that
of
sentence.
really cool. I was just
Oh,
saying that's what part of what makes the movies really.
yeah. It is part of what makes
Yeah.
them really cool. And there is more nuance to it than I think in some ways when someone is just thinking of this movie as like, oh, I saw it when I was 12 and haven't thought about it since then. But isn't that movie, where these things happen? It's like it's easy to think of only the high points and lose some of that nuance. But boy, I just really loved her character, and I believed it when she started coming around because it was not a slow, or rather it was not a quick abrupt change. It was kind of a slow turnaround from like this guy's a dope to this guy's, it's cute that he has these ideals, but he's never going to last. And like, gosh, wouldn't it be kind of nice if there were more people like him? And gosh, boy, a lot of these other people, now that I've seen one of the alternatives, they all seem kind of garbage now. And oh boy, wouldn't it be, he's no way he's going to win, but wouldn't it be great if he did? Well, what would it take? What would it take? I could help him. I could do it. And I loved that progression, and it was just great. And there was the moment where before the filibuster where he essentially had given up. He'd been convicted in the committee and was just going to leave. He wasn't even going to show up for the day they were
That's
going to
a
expel
powerful
him.
scene, by the way.
Yeah, and he goes back to the Lincoln Memorial because that was one of the places he went on his first little walkabout, and that's how she knew to find him there.
Yes.
And that
Underrated
scene,
scene.
that scene is really incredible too, and it actually sums up what I kind of really take away from the movie because on the one hand, it's there's a little bit of contrivance, even though like I believe it in the performance, just the idea that we really only get a happy ending because one of the bad guys had a crisis of conscience, which I want to talk more about in a second, but this is really the heart of it because it crystallizes, I think, like some of the frustration watching the movie is realizing this movie came out in what, 1939,
Hmm.
pre World War II. And
Hmm.
there are lots of things that are different than now. For example, there are hardly any women around. It's still a little weird to see these like 10-year-old kids acting as pages running all over the place. I don't think they do that anymore.
Yeah.
Um, so some of those things, but just seeing all of this corruption and everything and realizing like there's not been any progress on that stuff. It's like it seems impossible. It's unstoppable. How could you ever defeat that kind of thing? It's going to be there forever. It's baked in, and you could start feeling like we're nothing is better. It might be worse. Like, so for as idealistic as this movie was back in 1939, here we are, no better, and that sort of thing. Having that sort of feeling, but when he's there at his lowest, about to leave, about to give up, having basically been persuaded, you were right all along. This place isn't worth it. Like, my ideals turned out like to mean nothing. Like, this whole idea I had of teaching, kids to believe in these ideals was a waste of time, because those ideals don't actually mean anything. Everyone's just criminals, and it's all just worthless. But what she is telling him is like, that's because there are so many people like that. It's all anyone can ever do. Like, is to keep fighting, because the darkness will be there whether the light fights or not. And even if you can never defeat it all the way, the only light there's going to be is the light that you bring to it. And so, like, even if you can't ever win all the way, you sure can lose all the way. I don't know, and so I'm obviously paraphrasing what she says, but just this idea that even if you feel like it's a lost cause, that doesn't mean that you should abandon the fight.
Right.
But and of course that's what kind of comes into play with the whole thing of like what is it that persuades Senator Payne to have this crisis of conscience. It is only the purity of the conviction that that Jefferson Smith displays, right? That his courage of conviction and willingness to do what he thinks is right, even at great personal cost to himself, is the thing that persuades him. And so we could try to make the case this, like, that's why we, as much as it's sometimes just, naive, it's dumb, you have to be more realistic, you have to be more pragmatic, but sometimes it is only that idealism that can move the other side. But, then there's also a little bit of a cynical piece of, like, all of these sort of platitudes about fighting the good fight. I mean, both sides can say that stuff, right?
Yep.
Rarely is it as simple as someone who says, yes, I am corrupt, I am a bad person doing evil things.
Well, I feel like we're supposed to be kind of left with that in this movie. Like, I don't think that is supposed to be as contrite as it sort of feels in the moment. Like, I think they knew when they made this that there was an understanding that this only worked because the guy confessed. And like, that's what we need to pay attention to in Washington, is the fact that, like, this stuff exists, and if no one confesses, no one knows. And so I like I said, the first time I watched this movie, I was much younger, and I was just sort of left with this sort of idealist guy goes in there and shakes up the system, which is part of what happened. But watching it again, it's just so much more nuanced and powerful, across a lot of different areas. And it's left me I just have a better appreciation for this film. Not that I thought it was, I mean, I was fine the first time I saw it, but I really see that, and I see that as, those things that you're talking about as what we're looking at from now. I feel like they knew that going into this movie, that the happy ending was sort of contrived, and that was kind of the major point behind it. is that you can't have this happy ending. If this situation really existed in Washington, this would never have the happy ending. Like he would actually be thrown out of Washington. He would have to give up, and the bad guys would win. So,
Yeah. I think the one part that
and the bad guys
does,
would win a lot in Washington.
yeah, well, that's the thing too, is that the thing that's harder to,
But yeah,
well, the
they're
thing that,
not always as bad. Also, which
yeah.
is I think the other interesting point of this movie with the other senator is that like at what point are you like the bad guy or
Mhm.
just a guy making compromises so you can do other good things? I
Can
feel like
you
there's a
still hear
lot of
me?
that. Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure,
Okay.
because
Sorry.
do you see me again now, or is it still black?
Uh, yes, I found a way to make. So what I did was I shrunk the thing, blew it to full screen. Like after playing with it enough, it eventually like clicked back in. So
Okay,
yes,
good.
I can see it.
So just want to double check, making sure that was still working. Okay,
Yep,
but
we're good.
yeah, so the thing, just talking about like contemporary politics without getting too deep in the weeds there, the
Mm-hmm.
thing that's a little bit depressing is the feeling that like it's still portrayed in the movie as though evidence of corruption, shock horror, surely their career is finished. Except that I feel like what we've seen recently is like, oh, well, no. All they have to do is just say, nope. And apparently nobody cares. Well, that's an overstatement, but the point just being that there are
I
a
get your
lot of
point, though.
people
Yeah.
who, for there are a lot of people, and I guess this isn't even new because I know people have said it, like I know people for sure said it about Nixon, but things like saying, a crooked blank is better than an honest blank, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing, right?
Yep.
So in any event, it's hard to watch, like the thing that I do come away from this movie feeling is, there is a bravery in continuing to fight even when it would seem that you have lost, because you have to recognize that that is the only way to ever, like there's too much darkness to ever defeat it entirely. But that's why we need people just to be prepared to enlist in that forever fight. But the only other thing is that some of that same language like can easily be co-opted by whatever you would consider the other side. It just reminds me like one of the quotes that people like, from comics from Captain America that people like to trot out is like really inspiring is this bit where he's like, when you're sure you're right, no matter how many people tell you you're wrong, you stand firm, and no matter how many times they tell you to move out of the way, you stand right there and you look them in the eye and say, no, you move. And I'm like, well, yes, except both sides can say that. And then
I'm,
what?
I'm sorry. That reminded me of a joke. The sorry. Have you heard the joke where like when so if you're a 30-year-old living with your parents and somebody asks you, oh, do you live with your parents? The alpha response is to say, no, they live with me. Like that's what that thing felt like. Like, no, you get out of the way. Like,
Yeah.
no, my parents live with me
Well, I feel
in
like
their
there's
house.
like,
Like,
yeah, the nuance there that immediately comes to mind though is that like I think there could be a meaningful distinction there of like, is it your house that you paid for that they are living in, or are you living in the house that they paid for?
right. Like if you actually dig into that, but like it's
Hmm.
sort of a,
But yeah, no, I agree though, just in terms of the idea that it's literally just a reframing of the, yeah.
right, which is exactly what you just like the whole
Hmm.
point of like, no, you get out of the way. Like, okay, well, you what? Like, because that's
Yeah.
the same thing. Like, okay, who's really in the way? Like,
Well, right, and if we just want to like, if we want to just apply, that comic book logic thing, like they actually have Captain America say that in one of the movies. I feel like maybe Civil War, where and that's actually the context from the original line in the comics too, was in that comic event, where just the implication being, if you're sure you're right, it doesn't matter how many of your friends and family and everyone tell you you're wrong. You just stick with your courage of your convictions. Except that, like, isn't that also Thanos' thing? He's so sure he's right. Doesn't matter how many people tell him he's wrong. So
Fair enough.
yeah. So that's the fault in that line of reasoning, in my opinion. But
Yeah.
so overall, it's hard to feel in this current day and age of politics like I'm really able to come away from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington feeling inspired about politics, or believing, yes, like, yes, our ideals are the right ones, that sort of thing. It's more kind of a matter of like, gosh, you got to do the best you can, but it's going to be a messy, depressing job every day of the week. But the reception at the time, actually, and this is maybe one point of change. I don't know if we want to call it positive or negative or whatever, but apparently when the movie came out, the response from Washington, D.C., by and large, was shock, horror, how dare you imply that our governmental process is riddled with corruption. We can't have people watch this overseas because they'll think that America is not great like we really are. And apparently that was actually a lot of the reception, is people thought that it was too negative about the American system of government. And then apparently it was also simultaneously banned by fascist regimes because they thought that people would see, like, oh, hey, look, a functional democracy, we should try that. And so it kind of weirdly got reviled from both ends of the political spectrum, so like that.
Which is hilarious because, like, I just double checked to make sure I was fact checking properly.
Mm-hmm.
But Teapot Dome was in 21 to 23, like well before this movie came out.
Yeah.
Like, that was literally the biggest scandal in our government prior to Watergate.
Yeah.
Like, it is why the debate happens as to whether Warren Harding or Nixon are the worst presidents ever. And that happened 15 years before this movie, or 17 years before this movie came out.
Mm-hmm.
So for them to get all up in arms about what this is portraying, I mean, screw them. Like, like, you guys had some very public. I mean, all the carpetbagging happened before them. Like, I'm trying to remember all my American history. Like, it's creeping out of my brain right now.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a lot of bullshit that happened.
Oh yeah. I think
they weren't so fucking pure in 1939,
right,
in the Senate.
Well, I wonder, though, because one of the notable things about this movie is that it really doesn't mention party at all. Like, it does not identify either party or identify even the opposition versus the minority, or like the majority versus the minority in this movie. Like, that's just a non-issue.
I thought that was clever, by the way.
Yeah, no, I agree, because it's trying to sidestep any contemporary politics, which is really not what it's trying to do. And it makes it more timeless as a result.
Right, exactly. It helps it live on, to your point. It makes it more timeless, yeah.
But, I think, like, the modern thing is that, like, everybody acknowledges, yes, there's lots of corruption on the other side. Those evil blanks do all the corrupting. We're the good ones. Yeah.
Well, I think that's part of what the point of this movie was, is that they're not trying to define it that way. I know it's a little bit separate from this, but I do want to touch on before we leave this. Mm-hmm. The trope of not identifying the state that they're from, it's kind of clever.
Yeah.
Like, because you go through it and they're talking about, like, the dam and the park or the camp and all this stuff, and it really feels like a very California or West Coast state. And also the fact he had to travel to Washington so far. But then when you find out, like, Taylor lives in Jackson, well, there ain't no Western towns named after Jackson. I'll tell you that. That is very Southern. And And there's another point where they're talking about like stuff that's happening in the Southwest, while they don't like attribute it directly to the state.
Mm-hmm.
So they've kind of hit like a number of parts of the
Yeah.
country, and they leave it super vague in a way that's kind of interesting. Like, I don't know. I thought it was a neat little thing because you're always trying to guess, but then they're throwing another like fact in there about the state that's like, oh well, it couldn't be the other state I guessed,
Mm-hmm.
but so it really is an anonymous state by the end of it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. I agree, and I think it's the same reason that it was they avoided the party names is that
right?
just like it's not actually relevant to the story, and it would really just be a distraction. Apparently, one of the previous like working titles though was called "The Gentleman from Montana." So I think that you know they made the decision as in development to not list the state, but apparently that was the original story conception.
Hmm.
But apparently, it was also partly intended to be like it got cobbled together from a couple of different things. One of the other things that it was apparently going to be was a sequel to Mr. Deeds Goes to Town or whatever I don't remember the actual title of that. Because Mr. Deeds, the Adam Sandler movie, was obviously a remake of a Gary Cooper movie.
Right.
Um, Deeds. Yeah, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. That was right. So apparently, it was originally going to be a sequel to that with Gary Cooper, and apparently, when Gary Cooper wasn't available for whatever reason, and they changed it all up and Jimmy Stewart. Apparently, Jean Arthur, who was also the co-star in Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, was apparently a little salty about the cast change. She would have liked to work with Gary Cooper again, and so supposedly she didn't get along with Jimmy Stewart very well. But more points to the performances because they do
You
great.
don't see that, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so there's some interesting things. So like maybe before we move away entirely, this was apparently the first movie to lose 10 different Academy Award nominations. It was nominated for 11 and only won one. It won Best Writing Original Story, which apparently in 1940 was separate from screenplay, because it was also nominated for Best Writing Screenplay.
And lost.
Lost that. It lost Best Picture. It lost Best Actor for James Stewart. It lost Best Supporting Actor for Harry Carey, who was the president of the Senate.
Yes, he was so good, by the way.
Yeah. It was a very understated role because almost all of it is just facial expressions reacting to things happening. That's almost the whole role, but he's great.
It is so critical to the movie, though. Like,
right.
yeah.
It's so important to understand that at critical moments that he's kind of on Jefferson Smith's side.
Well, he's
or
kind of the guy on
open.
like, yeah, he's more like on the like I see him as like on the true democracy side. Like
Yeah.
he's trying to be on the side of like the reality of like what the ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he sees Jefferson Smith saying like, "Oh, well, I want to follow these rules. I want to make this stuff heard. Like this is what happened. Like this is not right."
Mm-hmm.
He's like, "All right, I'll let you keep going with that."
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. And he's actually listening the whole time. Like he's never like not reading the paper when he's talking.
Mm-hmm.
So you get this feeling that he's like understanding where he's coming from, and then he sees. He sees Saunders like telling him what to do, and he's almost like encouraging her.
He certainly doesn't tell her to stop.
He certainly doesn't because she's telling him the right things.
Yeah, and there's a critical moment too, just as the filibuster's getting ready to start, where two people kind of start speaking up at once, and all he would have had to do is recognize the other guy instead of Jimmy Stewart, and everybody kind of knows that like I am either giving him a chance to speak or not. And nobody would fault me if I picked the other guy. But I feel like it's important to let him at least have a chance to talk.
Yeah.
And I think had he known at that moment that it was going to be a filibuster, I don't know if he would have felt any differently about it, but
Right, but what he didn't want to have happen was these guys basically like, just go after him without him getting a chance to like say his piece, and
yeah,
he kind of felt like some endearing for the guy, and but none of that's done in words, like you said, and
yeah.
so it's very understated, but so good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, who did he lose to, by the way?
Well, let's see. Because Claude Rains was also nominated for Best Supporting Actor.
Also very good.
Thomas Mitchell from Stagecoach is who won Best Supporting Actor that year.
Got it. And what won Best Picture?
I'm scrolling down, but it was Gone with the Wind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fairly epic.
Well, actually, both of our movies this week, it's one of those where it's like, seems like it's a sort of movie that maybe ought to win Best Picture, but then we see, oh, well, what did win? Oh, yeah, okay. We'll get there for the other one. But, yeah, it was Gone with the Wind, but also that year in Best Picture was also Love Affair and Of Mice and Men and Stagecoach and Wizard of Oz. And also Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and a Wuthering Heights movie, and something called Dark Victory with Betty Davis.
Damn, 1939.
Yeah, right?
Strong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, in any event, so yeah, 2 Best Supporting Actor roles. Best Director, Frank Capra. Best Writing Screenplay. Best Art Direction. Best Sound. Best Film Editing. And Best Music. It lost all of those. So Best Writing Original Story was the only one that it won. That's a heartbreaking evening for the people who made this movie.
Yeah.
But as we saw, it was up against some really strong competition that year.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. All right, so with that done, are you ready to move on to number 25, To Kill a Mockingbird?
Quick break.
Sure.
But yes, I am ready to move on. Oh.
After these messages, we'll be right back. And no messages, I will read from the trivia bits from IMDb trivia from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington while we wait. And so let's see. Bitterly denounced by Washington insiders angry at its allegations of corruption, yet banned by fascist states in Europe who were afraid it showed democracy works. And apparently, in 1942, when a ban on American films was imposed in German-occupied France, the theaters chose Mr. Smith Goes to Washington for their last movie before the ban went into effect. And one Paris theater reportedly screened the film nonstop for 30 days prior to the ban. Also, apparently, the scenes where James Stewart wanders around in amazement at the Washington monuments were, stolen shots because they didn't actually get permission to film there. Let's see. In his autobiography, Frank Capra states that after the film's general release, he and Harry Cohn received a cablegram from U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph P. Kennedy, saying that he felt the film would damage America's prestige in Europe and should therefore be withdrawn from European distribution. In response, they mailed favorable reviews of the film to Kennedy, which persuaded him not to pursue the matter any further, even though he still maintained his doubts.
Forgot when we're actually like live streaming, not podcasting, you can't pause. So you have to filibuster.
Filibuster. Oh, but actually, this one little bit of trivia I do want to mention. It's unrelated to the political aspect, but Jean Arthur's left side was considered her best side, so the sets had to be constructed in a way that whenever she entered, she would be photographed on that side. And as soon as I read that, I was just going, actually, yeah, she absolutely is in the movie where we see her from she is on the right side of the screen, looking to the center, towards the center of the screen, so we see her left side.
Literally, almost always.
Yeah. Almost every scene, yeah.
That's funny.
Because when they're up in the gallery with Diz, she's always turned to that direction.
Yeah,
when
she's
always sitting,
looking that way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny.
That is funny.
Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to number 25, To Kill a Mockingbird, 1962 movie starring Gregory Peck, written by Harper Lee based on her novel To Kill a Mockingbird, and Horton Foote wrote the screenplay about Atticus Finch. And so specifically, the movie tells the kid's eye version of this small town attorney, Atticus Finch, participating in a trial of a falsely accused black man in the South, set during the. I don't think they say the year specifically, but it's got to be like early to mid 30s, right? It's meant to be a couple of years after the stock crash.
Yeah, it was in or after the Great Depression, so
Yeah.
it was like somewhere in that time frame.
Yeah.
I
So oddly enough,
feel like the book was told from Scout's point of view too, but maybe I'm wrong.
I believe that's the case.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
thought,
yeah.
which I think, the movie sort of like lends credence to, and then it lets Scout like narrate
Hmm.
from like the future a
Yeah.
couple of times. But if I remember correctly, I think the whole book is from Scout's point of view.
Yeah, I think so. The movie kind of cheats that because there are several scenes where Scout is not present, but we see what's happening anyway.
Right.
It's usually almost always from the perspective of one of the kids, though, Scout or Jem sometimes. It,
Yes.
there's not very many scenes where none of the kids would have been present.
I feel like the only time is when they're actually like in court. Like I don't remember the kids being there.
No, the kids, they were in court. They were up in
They are
the
there.
gallery, remember?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Notably sitting with the colored people.
that's right.
Hmm. I'm doing finger quotes, by the way, for anyone just listening to
Yes.
audio.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I'm not remembering any scenes though that the kids weren't there then.
Yeah.
Um,
But certainly it's not always Scout. There are definitely scenes where it's just Jem.
yeah.
There are no
There's definitely
other.
like and there's some they kind of like you said they cheat a little bit, and then it's
Hmm.
like it's Atticus and somebody else talking, but the
Yeah.
implication is that Jem can hear them,
Hmm.
so he comes
Yeah,
his scene. You know.
it's not very concerned with the verisimilitude of what the kids would have actually been able to see and hear. Um, but by and large, the story told from their perspective, and so it's a little bit interesting just with the comparing it to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, that in some respects this is a movie made in the 60s but depicting the time in which Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was actually set, or more or less. Very different setting, of course, um, but yeah. So the by and large of it is we have the kids running around doing kid things, small town kid things, but brushing against, but through contact with their father, who is working on this case. They learn about the case, and I think the real kind of the story of the movie is really kind of Scout and Jem learning good ideals to hold from their paragon of a father in a lot of ways. That's what the story is. Watching him react to all of these various different situations and learning from him is kind of what the story is about.
Yeah. It's a great story.
Hmm.
By
Hmm.
the way. I mean, let's
Yeah.
just leave with that.
By sheer coincidence, there was a podcast from the Washington Post, does daily podcasts, and I don't actually listen to them all the time, but just by sheer coincidence, there was the headline story of one today was about To Kill a Mockingbird, and in particular, it's a stage production where they talked to the actor playing Tom Robinson, who is the falsely accused man in the court. That's the central, showpiece of this story, and talking about giving him a little bit more agency as a character, which it's certainly true that like he really doesn't have any in this version of the story. Like, and there's reasons for that, but it's also true, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
he's really not given the opportunity to make any decisions at all in the story. Um, but they talk about including a little bit of how apparently before Atticus Finch was assigned the case, he had another attorney who encouraged him to accept a guilty plea. And so apparently, what they do in this stage production is add some stuff to have it be a decision that Tom Robinson makes with Atticus's advice of saying, I think that it would be better if you didn't do it, to say that instead of admitting to something you didn't actually do. But
Right.
the risk is if they convict you without a guilty plea, they might put you to death. But then, of course, as the story turns out, he is killed when trying to escape. Finger quotes again from
Right.
people
Yeah,
listening
because
to
the
the audio.
implication is that they basically turned him loose and said, "Run
Yeah,
if you can get away, you get away, but we're going to be shooting at you." And we
yeah.
shot at you, and we won.
Well, see, I'm not convinced that like so. The movie never confirms that, right?
No,
All we
no,
see,
definitely.
well, but what I'm saying is, all we get is Atticus repeating what he has just been told, which was that he tried to escape and was killed. And in particular, they tried to shoot to wound, but whoops, they killed him. But see, the thing is that the darker implication there might well be it wasn't, hey, run and we'll be shooting at you. It might have been, we're going to just shoot you, period.
Oh yeah, true. I guess I didn't even get that dark with it.
It might be a, we know you're guilty, and now your crooked lawyer is going to just try to get you out on an appeal. We're going to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, see, I saw it as they turned him loose because they wanted to shoot him in the back, running away to give themselves cover.
Well, I mean, theoretically, they still could have done that, but I guess the implication was just there was never really a chance.
Right. Either way that we look
Yeah.
at it, that he wasn't. He didn't just all of a sudden decide to run away.
Yeah, but it's well drawn in the movie and relies on previous beats having been set up that there's kind of a desire for mob justice in the
Yes.
town, and that there had been considerations about that prior. So the fact that the movie doesn't have to say explicitly that that's what happened, for us to think that it's quite possible that's what happened.
Right. Well, you're left with the feeling that the deputies go in there with the understanding that they have a pretty strong appeal. Like they won in this very narrow scenario with like
Mm-hmm.
12 white guys as jurors because exactly what Atticus's like closing argument
Yeah.
is, which is, there is no evidence. They're
Mm-hmm.
relying on you saying that white people tell the truth and black people don't.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's happening here.
Yeah.
And the deputies know that's also likely what happened. And so when he gets killed, like that's what you're feeling is like they realize he has a legit appeal if he gets to the right place. So we just want it all to go away, the same way that Emma Jean wanted it to go. Everybody just wants it to go away.
Yeah.
And the easiest way to make it go away is to kill the black guy that is involved.
Right.
And it's just absolutely like heartbreaking and astounding, like of a movie and a book. So
Yeah. So, but like that, it's done. Tastefully feels like the wrong word, but I'm glad that it doesn't. It's not exploitative about that stuff.
no, it
Um,
definitely lets you come to those conclusions and like kind of like marinate in them yourself and
right.
how you feel about them.
It
Yeah.
doesn't shy away necessarily from doing that, especially given the time in which it was made. That I like that it goes far enough to make it clear to the audience what is being meant to what's being implied, but without having to force us to watch it.
Yes.
And so that's I think a dilemma that uh, many people have discussed in terms of modern media criticism is it's one thing to depict pain of an oppressed person with the desire to elicit compassion and maybe change people's minds, but at what point does it just become exploitative?
Yes.
And
This
that's
movie is a master stroke of how to like walk that line. I mean, I still believe that.
Mhm.
50 years later, 55 years later. I mean, I think this movie does a phenomenal job of exposing us and letting us, like, walking us all the way there, but not hitting us over the head with it. Like,
Hmm. Well,
there, you could be a person that watched this movie and had no idea that that's what the point was. I mean, you'd be a sad person, but that from what happens in the movie, like, you could walk away with that.
yeah.
You know,
Well, and so I think that's why having it be from the perspective of the kids is important in a couple of respects. One is that it allows you to be a little bit more circumspect about some of those things because it makes sense that some of those details would be kept from the kids. And also the idea of kind of having to put together through inference and connecting dots things that must be true, but also sort of just like the the idea of having it not only be from the perspective of the kids, but specifically from the perspective of a grown up scout reflecting on the things that she learned from her father. Right? Because it's not just from the perspective of the kid, it's from the perspective of the kid now grown up remembering it.
right? Which is, like I said, that's how I remember. And I don't have the book here, but that's how I remember the book. Like,
Yeah.
all being was like written like it was like Scout's memoir.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I believe that. I haven't read the book version, but I that's my understanding. The but so to have it be a matter of the story as it's told to us, Scout the person understands things now as she's telling us this story that she didn't understand when she went through it.
Right.
And that's why there are and that's why I think we don't mind some of the bits where it's clear that, like, well, Scout wasn't there for this scene, how would she know? But the thing is, she's telling the story as she pieced it together later, essentially.
Right.
You know, and so we have lots going on. Obviously the big court case is generally what people remember from this movie because it's contains really some of the most powerful bits, but there's a whole lot of the movie that is really not necessarily focused there. Like, we have just these kids, running around in this small town. There's an early sequence where it's like, someone has come to pay Atticus for legal work with a bag full of hickory nuts because the implication is no cash.
Right.
It's the crash has hit a lot of people and hit farmers the worst. And there's an interesting question where Scout is like, doesn't have cash because he's poor. Are we poor? And he says yes, but certainly an implication of, but we live in a reasonably nice house and can afford clothes and food and having a servant, a maid, Calpurnia, who seems,
We're less poor than the farmers because
yes,
the crash hit them harder. Yeah.
yeah, and also, just that sort of, there's still that very segregated aspect of the culture too, right? Like, there's the place where all of the African American, all the black people live, right? It's like
Mhm.
that, and that is separate, and it's like you like, he's comparing, are we poor? Well, yes, but maybe not compared to the farmers. But then it's like, there's not even a consideration of, oh, also Calpurnia, the woman who cleans our dishes and washes our clothes and takes care of you guys. Well, she also lives in another place too, where, but
Also poor.
yeah.
Yeah.
um, but in any event, they're kind of running around in this area. There's lots of the classic sort of, kids in a small town sort of tropes, like, the scary old house with the, oh, there's the Boo Radley. They say he stabbed his dad and he's a scary monster, and, I dare you to go and touch the door, and that sort of stuff. and meeting the new kid who's only in town for the summer. Um, and apparently Dill, this third wheel kid that hangs out with Scout and her brother Jim, apparently in real life based on Truman Capote, because Harper Lee and Truman Capote were childhood friends.
Interesting. I hadn't realized that.
Yeah, I hadn't either until I read the IMDb trivia. And
That would
apparently,
make sense too, because I mean, he's kind of the catalyst to a lot of this, in that he encourages them to take a lot of those risks with Boo Radley and like
right,
all.
yeah, like it was
Yeah,
like, oh, it's my last night in town. I don't want to leave not having done some of that stuff. But he's also a little bit of a know-it-all, even though it's kind of demonstrated. It's kind of like he's bragging about being able to read when Jem's like, Scout hasn't even been to school yet. She can read.
yeah.
But apparently, Truman Capote also based a character on off of Harper Lee in one of his things too. So I'm not a Truman Capote expert. I only just read what I saw on IMDb trivia. But yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah, but there are a lot of childhood rumors about what's going on with that house and Boo Radley, and is he crazy? And everyone wants to he never leaves the house apparently. But we also know that when they were trying to sneak onto the property at night and then had to run away, we don't know exactly how it happened, but a gun was fired. We don't know if Arthur Boo's father, Mr. Radley, like was actually trying to shoot at Jem. Unclear. Might have just shot into the air. We don't know. Um, but certainly did fire a gun, which is a kind of a serious business. Don't do this anymore.
Yep.
But there's also lots of these interesting little clues that something more interesting is going on. For example, we don't learn this till later actually, but when Jem got his pants caught on the fence as they're trying to get away, he goes back and finds them uncaught from the fence and just nicely folded. It's like, who did that? That's weird.
Yep.
Also, they apparently kept finding interesting little toys and presents put in this little notch in a tree near the property, and apparently sometimes made these little bird calls to like attract his attention over to it, and kept leaving little presents for them there until we see the dad, Mr. Radley,
Cement the thing
cement it
up.
up.
Yeah.
Because, and again, it's like it's all very mysterious and kind of spooky, but with a little bit of a hint of like, something more is going on there than just a monster.
Yep.
And so that's kind of interesting, although we spend a fair amount of time on that, and then there's literally a voiceover of saying, okay, now we're going to focus on the other part of the story for a while, so don't worry about it. It's just, it's like, that was the last time we talked about him for a while.
About Boo Radley for like 6 months.
Yeah.
And here's what we did during the rest of the time. Yeah.
So it's kind of fun that we just spend a lot of time on that, and then it's like, oh, but now we're moving on. But then, of course, like, through all of this, we're getting the beginnings of Atticus taking Tom Robinson as a client. And when they bring him in for trial, there's this rumors like, oh, they might just be going to break into the jail to just kill him. And so he goes and basically just like sits on the stoop. There's an interesting moment where we think at first, like, is he going to get like a gun? But he's got a lamp that he's almost holding like a gun, and we're like, wait, what is that? And apparently, no, it's just actually a lamp that he sets up so he can read while sitting on the stoop of the jail.
Yep.
And so the kids follow him partly so that we, the audience, can be exposed to what happens there, but also when they see this mob that looks like they might just be willing to push right past Atticus to do what they're going to do, they run up to try to defend him, and it's complicated. But ultimately, what kind of cools the mob down is Scout recognizing Mr. Cunningham, this farmer who had been embarrassed to have to pay in hickory nuts earlier, and recognizing and saying, "Hey, don't you remember me?" Now, I wonder a little bit at that scene because I feel like even a 6-year-old in those circumstances would probably be able to read people's body language enough to not be so like open and like, gosh, Mr. Cunningham, why are you acting so like, it's, I think a 6-year-old would probably be scared in that circumstance and not as open. But I don't know. It's not a
I
big
mean,
deal. It's just
yeah,
like it's one of those places though where like kid acting has evolved since 1962 in terms of what we expect.
fair enough.
In terms of how naturalistic they're meant to be. Although, honestly, what's her name? Uh, Gosh, I'm suddenly like not. I'm looking for the actress's name. It's not high on the list, honestly. Actually, for this looking at this cast list. Um, anyway, the kid was apparently nominated for an Oscar for her role. And I'm going to have her name here in just a second. Mary Badham was Best Supporting Actress role nominee as Scout, and she, but she diffuses the whole thing right by kind of just sort of shaming Mr. Cunningham without meaning to, just
Right.
by existing in such a different context
In
than he
human
had.
context, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was all worked up in a sort of this whole feeling of righteous fury, like, oh, this guy did a bad thing and we're going to go punish him and that sort of thing. But kind of getting caught up in the moment of that because he's like, as far as we know, he's completely unconnected to anything to having to do with the case, except that he is also a farmer and so therefore perhaps
Got recruited.
identifies with the
Yeah.
the farmer family that has a daughter that is now the this accusing victim, but at the same time we haven't really learned the details of the case yet at this point. But of course, all of that kind of develops up to we have several moments with Scout learning various lessons, like the idea of, with Mr. Cunningham earlier, where Atticus is saying, like, you didn't have to make a big deal about bringing me out to thank him because I think he's actually embarrassed to have to pay this way. And so he would rather just kind of do it quietly. And then also, with the kid of saying, hey, you know, when he's a guest in your house, don't laugh at him just because like the roast that he has never gotten to have before and never gotten to have syrup and he eats it weird. Well, yeah, he's a little bit strange because he is very he's unfortunate. He doesn't get all of these fancy things that you get on a regular
Right.
basis.
He
So
doesn't realize that syrup's not like a thing you just dump on everything. Like he
right,
likes syrup,
yeah,
it's a luxury for him, so he poured it on everything. Like,
yeah.
yeah,
And so just having her learn these various lessons, um, him, trying to tell her not to fight, which that one doesn't really stick very well. Um, but she, keeps getting in fights, and all of these things are kind of in the backstory. But then all that kind of leads up to the big court case, which is, of course, the kind of the centerpiece of the movie, right? And I mean, what's made very clear to us is that what really happened is that we had a young woman who perhaps was found herself attracted to this black man who came by, walked by her house on his way home from work sometimes, and she was awkward and repressed and did some things that were kind of uncomfortable, and then her father saw and got really mad and beat her up, and now she has to say that he took advantage of her, or else it makes it seem like she did something wrong.
right.
And so it's meant to be very clear to us, the audience, that it was her father who beat her up, and basically either she got came to it on her own or did it just to try to avoid being in trouble with her dad. But the accusation was entirely falsified. He was there in the house only at her invitation, and it was her dad that beat her up, not him. And there's a number of ways that we're meant to see that that's exactly what it is. But ultimately, it comes down to there's not really any evidence one way or another. So it's just a question of, do you believe him or do you believe her? Right? If she's insisting, no, this is what happened, even though her story varies from her father's in several key respects, like this whole bit of like, you know, it happened, and the next thing I knew, my dad's coming in and saying, "Who done it? Who done it?" Except that her dad had just testified. I saw him in there and knew who it was and chased him.
Yeah.
So it's like, we learned she had strangle marks around both sides of her neck, and a black eye on one side of her face. But Tom Robinson can only use one arm, and it's the other side. So it's like there's just so many little pieces where they don't have to beat us over the head with it, but they're making it very clear to us he's innocent.
Right. That this isn't a like we don't know for sure. They make it very clear to us without beating, like you said, without beating us over the head,
Mm-hmm.
that is what happened.
Right. They leave
Tom's story
yeah.
is true.
Right, but they leave us to draw our own conclusion about it.
Yeah.
Like they don't ever have the false accusation. They never have the girl or her father ever admit that it's a lie.
Hmm.
They never give us explicit verification. They only present evidence that allows us to draw our own conclusion, and it does that in a number of respects. But ultimately, even though we have Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch mounting a passionate defense that there's no evidence here, you can't just take her word for it because she's white and he's black. Do your duty. But unfortunately, it is not enough to convince this all-white jury in this small town where they know the farmer and they don't know Tom Robinson, or rather, he's one of them, and they convict him. And so, even though Atticus insists, like, "Hey, we're going to appeal. Don't worry. We thought we'd probably lose this one." Apparently, what he's told is Tom Robinson tries to escape and is killed. In the meantime, we've also had a couple of scares where this Yule family, Bob Yule, the father in particular, has been creepy and threatening towards Atticus and his kids. And then, we fast forward a little bit, but apparently he tries to attack them in the woods and the kids are, Jem is hurt, but Atticus the two kids are saved by a mysterious person who kills Bob Yule and saves them. Turns out Boo Radley, who is watching, because he's a good guy after all. But that's when we get to this whole big sort of moral climax moment of Boo Radley has done a bad thing for a good reason. Everyone's kind of better off. So the problem here is telling the truth produces a worse outcome for almost everybody. So do you tell the truth just because, even if you know that it actually makes things worse? Or do you tell a lie?
I just lost you.
Uh-oh, you lost me? You're frozen on my end. Hangouts, technology, woo! All right, so hopefully we're a little frozen here, but all right, hopefully he'll come back shortly. I'll read some trivia bits from To Kill a Mockingbird. Gregory Peck's summation speech, which runs for 6 minutes and 30 seconds, was nailed in a single take. Let's see. Brock Peters, who played Tom Robinson in the film, delivered Gregory Peck's eulogy on the date of his funeral and burial, Monday, June 16th, 2003. All right, well, so this isn't working. Let me message Mike just to see if we need to drop the Hangout and restart it real quick. All right, so we'll get to this. There's some trivia here that we'll talk about more in a moment. The watch used in the film was a prop, but Harper Lee gave Gregory Peck her father's watch after the film was completed because he reminded her so much of him. Atticus Finch was modeled on Harper Lee's own father, Amasa A.C. Lee, an attorney and Alabama state legislator whose 1923 defense of a black client partially inspired the novel's trial. Like Amasa Lee, the character of Atticus Finch was not only an attorney but a state legislator and a widowed single father. Okay. You there, Mike? Oh, nope, we lost Mike. Hopefully he'll rejoin in just a moment. We got infinite recursion for the meantime. And so Gregory Peck met with Amasa Lee, then 82 years old, and formed a strong bond with him. Unfortunately, Lee died while the movie was filming, so Harper gave Peck his watch and chain. Peck was wearing that same watch and chain at the Academy Awards ceremony the following year when he won the Oscar for Best Actor. Spoilers, he won Best Actor. All right, hopefully we can get Mike back in the call here. And director Robert Mulligan learned quickly not to rely on numerous takes as he found that his child cast members became less natural and spontaneous after the first several. And apparently the two kids playing Scout and Jem had their own issues together. Oh, but the character of Dill was based on Truman Capote, who had been a childhood friend of Harper Lee when he was sent to live with relatives in Lee's hometown each summer. Capote in turn based one of his characters in his literary work, Other Voices, Other Rooms, upon his recollection of Harper Lee. In interviews, Lee implied as much, and in American Masters, Season 26, Episode 3, Hey Boo, Harper Lee, and To Kill a Mockingbird, it was stated that Dill was the only character which Lee admitted to having fully based on a real person. Okay. Rejoin. Hopefully we can get Mike back soon. These things happen sometimes, alas. So, despite the closeness of their characters, Mary Badham and Philip Alford, who played Jem, did not get along while filming. Mary would mimic Philip saying his lines off camera so that he couldn't concentrate. However, it might not have been malice on her part. In the scene where Atticus drives with the children to speak with Helen Robinson, Mary is mouthing Gregory Peck's lines. It seems unlikely that she was trying to break Gregory Peck's concentration. It's possible instead that she memorized everyone's lines in each of her scenes, and she wouldn't know what her next line would be until she recited the line immediately preceding it. That seems kind of speculative. All right, so we're having a little bit of trouble with getting Mike back in the call. So hopefully, I'm going to try something here. I'm going to try dropping this call, which is going to briefly disrupt that, but let's try to get this restarted. All right. Live television, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. Saying, Mike may have lost internet, so, All right. So hopefully we can resolve this soon. But these are the hazards when you're dealing with internet technology. So hopefully we can get moving. Oh, and so I now have the I have my spreadsheet on where we're having all of the different shows. Can zoom in on this a little bit. And so, actually, it's probably still hard to see on the screen there. Oops. So, let's. So, anyway, how's everybody doing tonight? Woo! So, what we have in the spreadsheet here, I've got a little bit of a. So it's not optimized, but so let's take a look at the list that we've got ahead of us still. So this column right here is the list of the original AFI list. So we can see that here we're at 26 and 25 with Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and To Kill a Mockingbird. Ahead of us in the next couple of episodes, E.T., the Extraterrestrial, Grapes of Wrath, Some Like It Hot. Aha! We've got a mic on your phone, I guess?
iPad.
That works too. Your internet's out, huh? Or technical issues at least?
Yeah, I mean, you can see it says no internet.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we can finish up our conversation.
Yes. So,
sorry to.
So I think we had just gotten to the point where the finale leaves us with kind of the moral question of which is the priority when it comes to moral decision making. Is it outcome based or is it ideal based? Right?
Right.
Because following the law, which obviously Atticus Finch feels very strongly about, being honest, which he feels very strongly about, this is definitely still a situation where that path is going to be harmful to people that they care about. And so it's a tricky question.
The title.
Yeah. So because the title, of course, comes from a line earlier where Atticus is talking about lessons taught to him by his own father, which is when he gets his first gun, which is a thing in this movie that's also a little bit of a sign of the times in the sense that these kids in this area, it's like, oh yeah, when did you get your first gun? 7? Sure. Anyway, talks about how, his father told him, I would prefer you just shoot cans with it, but eventually you might start feeling tempted to shoot at birds, and so you can shoot all the blue jays you want, but it would be sin to kill a mockingbird, is the line. And the reason is because blue jays are a nuisance. Like they'll dig up people's gardens, they'll build nests in inconvenient places, all sorts of things where it's not bad, like they're a pest in some ways. But a mockingbird, all they ever do is sing. They never hurt anybody, and it would be a sin to take that out of the world. And so that's why Scout advises, wouldn't it, because after Heck, the sheriff, insists that, his position, he's the one that actually advocates this, is to say, we're going to say Bob Ewell fell on his own knife. And so Atticus is feeling conflicted about it, but then Scout says, wouldn't it be like killing a mockingbird? Boo Radley never hurt anybody, well, except, it's also not 100% true in the sense that, but he is a good person who has done a good thing here by saving the lives of Scout and Jem from a bad person, and it took killing that person to do it, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it's also a question of what is the right path from here on. Is it better to go through the whole process of trying to prove in court that Boo doesn't need to be put in prison for killing Bob Ewell? Like, even if the court could be relied upon to produce the right outcome, is that the right way to go? And it's interesting, in some ways, very much like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, we are dealt with a little bit of a, if you have a good character, is there, lawful good versus chaotic good? It's like, if the law, okay, so my Hangout has just crashed now. Oh boy. Oh boy. It's unfortunate that I think increasingly this is going to be a problem for Hangouts. All right, so I got this back.
Was that my fault, or was that?
No, it's. I think. I don't know. I think increasingly Hangouts are likely to become less and less stable, though, because Google is no longer supporting them. But in any event, are we? You still hear me?
I do.
All right. So we're not seeing your video right now, but hopefully it'll pop back up. There you are. Okay.
Yes, here I am.
Aha. So yeah, just that's a tricky question of, on the one hand, believing that laws are important and necessary for a society to function, but at the same time recognizing sometimes it's not necessarily the best. But if you start getting into a mindset where you don't have to follow the rules anytime where it seems inconvenient, then what's the point, right? And so it's that sort of dynamic. But I think that it's meant to. I think we're meant to believe that it's the right thing to not tell in this circumstance, but that wrestling with the complexity of that is worthwhile.
Yes.
It's not a trivial question. But yeah, so that's, I think the other just last little bit of trivia to mention there is that Boo Radley, played by the very first screen appearance of Robert Duvall.
It's true. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So, I mean, I'm kind of losing my voice, and we're struggling with increasing technical difficulties.
Now let's wrap it up and
Yeah.
let's rank them and
Yeah,
get-
so I
get
think
going.
we're in agreement, though. To Kill a Mockingbird, good movie.
Yep.
All right, so let's talk about our list. Let's rank them. We've got, the original list puts Mr. Smith Goes to Washington at 26, To Kill a Mockingbird at 25. Do you know where you would like to shift them?
I'm trying to pull that up real quick. Do you have yours already?
No, I'm thinking about it right now.
Okay. I'm pulling mine up. Oh. I think I want to rank To Kill a Mockingbird first.
Okay.
And I'm going to put that at 34.
Okay.
Just
So,
below Lord of the Rings.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So still strong movie. I just, these ones above it, I just still think are so good.
Mm-hmm.
And then Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I mean, just for fun, I'm going to put it down at 56, right below All the President's Men, just because those are both Washington movies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know where else to put it. I know it's kind of in the bottom half, but I don't care where. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm doing with it.
All right. Yeah. I think those are in some ways approximate to where I'm thinking for my picks. Let me just finish with adjusting the spreadsheet. So, but yeah, I think that I'm going to put Mr. Smith Goes to Washington maybe even a little bit lower. I think, you know what? I think I'm going to put it at 58, just after Blade Runner and just before Nashville.
Okay.
And then To Kill a Mockingbird, a bit higher. At, let's see, let's put that. I'm going to put that, I think, after. Gosh. There's so this is where it really starts getting tricky, right? Because I'm just
Yeah.
like, you
They're
compare
all
it to
good.
movies that are so different. It's like, how do you compare King Kong to Kill a Mockingbird, right? Um, I think that I'm gonna put it just between Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Bridge on the River Kwai. Oops, there we go. Which is gonna be, let's see, we get it there. Which is gonna be, I think, 35. So almost the same as where you put it.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So that concludes this current session, and I know it's been a while since we did one of these, but hey, we're hopefully, maybe, we say this every time, but like, we can continue to try to uh, move things along. So the next two movies on our list would be number 24, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and uh, and number 23, The Grapes of Wrath. And we have both seen both of them.
Yes.
So the uh, where I'm lost track of some of this stuff. Okay, so I have complicated feelings thinking about ET, just because I remember loving it as a kid, rewatching it as a young adult, and going, ugh. I don't like this nearly as much as I remembered. It feels extremely schmaltzy and sentimental and contrived and manipulative, like Spielberg at his worst. But how will I feel going back now? Probably somewhere in between, is my guess.
So I never liked ET,
No?
but I'm going to go into it with an open mind
Mm-hmm.
because of the experiment that we're going through, and
Yeah.
I'm going to try to watch it from that perspective. So,
Yeah. So it's definitely like, there are lots of Spielberg movies I love, but the last time I watched this one, it was not one of them.
you know,
Yeah. But we'll
I'm not,
see.
I'm not optimistic, but I'm
Okay.
going to try to be.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Grapes of Wrath is, it's it's 1940 drama. It's heavy, but pretty good, as I recall.
Yeah.
So we'll leave it there. And so thank you, everybody, for watching and or listening and sticking with us through all of the technical difficulties. And we'll talk about more movies hopefully soon.
Thank you.